Bible Time, Dominic Steele. It's Friday morning and we come to chapter 21 of 2 Samuel today, and Dr. John Woodhouse notes in his opening paragraph on this section that this is one of the Bible's most difficult stories. It's not so much difficult to understand, it's difficult to hear, difficult to accept. The action actually only involves a very small number of people, but in Dr. Woodhouse's words, it's an account of personal suffering, unimaginable grief, and what feels like intolerable unfairness. And it's a story that's going to cause most sensitive readers to wonder what is going on, and our greatest difficulty is God's role in what happens. There are 4 sections to the story: the famine, the conversation, the execution, and the surprise. And look, it's so emotionally gut-wrenching and complex, this story. We're going to deal with it over several days, but do let me encourage you to read ahead in 2 Samuel 21. Just the first section today, the first 2 verses, the famine, and I'm reading here the 2 verses in full. During the reign of David, there was a famine for 3 successive years. So David sought the face of the Lord, and the Lord said, "It is on account of Saul and his blood-stained house. It is because he put the Gibeonites to death." The king summoned the Gibeonites and spoke to them. Now the Gibeonites were not a part of Israel, but were survivors of the Amorites. The Israelites had sworn to spare them, but Saul, in his zeal for Israel and Judah, had tried to annihilate them. So we have what we might call a natural disaster, a famine, like a flood, a bushfire or earthquake, or for that matter, an outbreak of COVID, an outbreak of Delta. I mean, there are things when you get these things, flood, bushfire, earthquake, COVID, that you can do to mitigate, but you can't avert them. You can't control them. They are, for good reason, sometimes called acts of God. So, chapter 21, 2 Samuel, during the reign of David, there was a famine for 3 successive years. So David sought the face of the Lord. David rightly appeals to God to find out what is going on. Now, last year, we looked at the book of Job. Job never finds out what the reasons for his suffering were. Job has had to come to terms with the fact that God may have had his reasons for bringing suffering on him, but he doesn't get to know them. And he has to just trust God in the end and honour God in all of that. However, Israel's suffering, and we are given a reason. David is given a reason why Israel is experiencing the famine. So it's different to what happens with Job. Chapter 21, verse 1, during the reign of David, there was a famine for 3 successive years. David sought the face of the Lord. The Lord said to him, "It is on account of Saul and his blood-stained house. It's because he put the Gibeonites to death." Now, immediately we're thinking a range of issues. First, Saul had done something wrong. As a result, his house, his family is guilty in God's sight. His family is guilty in God's sight even after Saul's death, and actually the guilt has spilled over to the whole of Israel, and hence the famine, the judgment. Now, that raises issues of collective guilt, collective responsibility, and we're reminded that that's different to how we think in Western society. Naturally, we have a very individualistic idea of responsibility and guilt, but in Eastern cultures, in the culture back then, and in the Bible's view, there is a greater sense of collective responsibility than the way we think. Now, what was it, though, that Saul had done to the Israelites? And a little further background. The Gibeonites were some of the original inhabitants of the land that is now known as Israel. And what had actually happened in the time of Joshua, earlier in the Bible, in Joshua 9, the Israelites come in to conquer the land. Why were the Israelites conquering the land? Because God was giving them the land. That's reason A. But reason B, they were God's instruments of justice on the then current wicked inhabitants of the land. And so the verse here, Genesis chapter 15, verse 16, important verse, "In the 4th generation your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites will have not reached its full measure." So the picture was in Genesis was the people currently living in the land, their sin's going to be so bad they're going to need to be judged, and you're going to be my instrument of judgment. Anyway, the Israelites, they've come into the land, both being given the land and judging the original inhabitants of the land, in Amorites, but also including this group called the Gibeonites. They come to a conversation with the Gibeonites in Joshua chapter 9, and the Gibeonites trick the Israelites. They say, oh, no, we're not inhabitants of the land, we're travellers through the land. So Joshua 14:9, they replied to him, your servants have come from a faraway land because of the reputation of the Lord your God. We've heard of his fame and all he did in Egypt. You jump down a bit, Joshua 14:15. So Joshua established peace with them, made a treaty to let them live, and the leaders of the community swore an oath to them. So Joshua says, you can live in the land. Promises by oath you can live in the land. Then 3 days later, they discover that the Gibeonites are not visitors just passing through, but they're actually long-term residents. But they made a binding oath. And so the Israelites have to keep their binding oath. And then centuries later, Saul breaks that oath. Saul puts the Gibeonites to death. So I'm looking at verse 2 of 2 Samuel 21. The king summoned the Gibeonites and spoke to them. The Gibeonites were not part of Israel, but were survivors of the Amorites. The Israelites had sworn to spare them, but Saul, in his zeal for Israel and Judah, had tried to annihilate them. So Saul had gone on a mission to wipe out the Gibeonites, even though his predecessors had sworn oaths that this would not happen. Many Gibeonites had been killed by Saul, and this little group is a surviving remnant. And so God, by sending the famine, is letting David know that something needs to be done to atone for Saul's actions. And at that point, we're actually going to leave it this morning and pick it up tomorrow with the Monday with the conversation. But just to note at this point, the Lord hasn't communicated to David what he should do about it. He's just communicated that the reason for the famine is Saul's sin. Now, on Monday, we'll start to see David work out what it is to do about it, and his first thing to do is consult the victims. Takeaway message: sin is serious. God is a God of justice. God will bring justice. He brought justice on the original inhabitants of the land. And here, where Saul has done the wrong thing, justice needs to be worked through. So that's for Monday on Daily Bible Time. Thanks for joining us today. God bless.